How narcissistic insecurity shapes sexual identity. Signaling explores a subtle psychological mechanism that often goes unnoticed because it disguises itself as confidence, freedom, charisma, or self-expression. Sexual identity signaling in narcissistic structures is rarely about authentic self-discovery, embodied comfort, or emotional truth. Instead, it often functions as a communication strategy driven by insecurity, nervous system regulation needs, and identity fragility. What appears externally as boldness, desirability, uniqueness, or magnetic presence is frequently an attempt to stabilize an internally unstable self-concept through external mirroring and emotional impact. At the foundation of narcissistic insecurity lies an underdeveloped internal sense of self. Early emotional environments that lack consistent safety, attunement, or unconditional validation often prevented the nervous system from learning stable self-regulation. Instead of forming an integrated identity grounded in internal coherence, the individual learned to experience self-worth as something that must be earned, proven, extracted, or defended externally. This produces an identity that feels real only when reflected back by others. Without external feedback, the internal experience becomes vague, empty, restless, or threatening. Sexual identity becomes a powerful signaling channel because it directly activates social attention, desirability, comparison, status, power, and emotional reaction. The body, attraction, appearance, desirability, and perceived sexual value provide immediate feedback from the environment. Compliments, attention, pursuit, envy, curiosity, and validation stimulate reward circuits in the brain that temporarily stabilize the nervous system. For narcissistic structures, this reinforcement can become deeply regulating and addictive, even when the individual is unaware of the underlying dependency. Rather than expressing sexuality as a natural extension of selfhood, narcissistic insecurity often shapes sexuality into a performance aimed at generating reaction and confirmation. Signals may be exaggerated, curated, strategically displayed, or constantly adjusted based on audience response. The individual may unconsciously monitor how they are perceived, how much attention they receive, how desirable they appear, and how much emotional impact they generate. Identity becomes flexible rather than stable, shifting according to what produces the strongest validation at any given time. This signaling is not always overt or flamboyant. In some cases, it appears as subtle superiority, selective exclusivity, emotional mystique, or carefully controlled availability. The goal remains the same: to generate distinction, desirability, and psychological leverage that reinforces the internal self-image. The narcissistic system is not seeking mutual connection, but rather confirmation of specialness, power, or uniqueness. Insecurity plays a central role in driving this behavior. Beneath the surface, confidence often lies chronic self-doubt, shame, and fear of inadequacy. Because direct contact with these emotions feels destabilizing or intolerable, the nervous system seeks to override them through external stimulation and affirmation. Sexual identity signaling becomes a defense against inner vulnerability. The stronger the insecurity, the more intensely the individual may signal desirability, uniqueness, or dominance to compensate. This mechanism also explains why narcissistic sexual identity signaling often fluctuates dramatically over time. When validation is abundant, confidence may appear inflated and expansive. When validation drops, insecurity may spike, leading to intensified signaling efforts, identity shifts, or sudden changes in presentation, behavior, or relational patterns. The identity remains externally regulated rather than internally anchored. Another important dimension is the relationship between control and signaling. Narcissistic insecurity often carries a fear of being powerless, unseen, or irrelevant. Sexual signaling can restore a sense of agency by influencing how others respond, emotionally and behaviorally. The individual may unconsciously enjoy the power of being desired, pursued, or reacted to because it stabilizes their internal sense of significance. This does not necessarily involve conscious manipulation, but the nervous system learns which signals reliably produce emotional response and reinforces those patterns automatically. Over time, this can distort authenticity. Because identity expression becomes tied to feedback loops, the individual may lose touch with genuine preferences, boundaries, and emotional truth. They may struggle to differentiate between who they are and how they are perceived. The self becomes performative rather than embodied. This creates internal fragmentation and increases dependence on external mirrors to maintain coherence. From the relational perspective, partners and observers may sense inconsistency, emotional shallowness, or performance-based connection beneath the surface charm or confidence. Attraction may feel intense but unstable. Intimacy may feel stimulating but emotionally thin. The relationship may revolve around image, validation, and reaction rather than mutual vulnerability and depth. This often leads to confusion, emotional exhaustion, and distorted attachment patterns in those involved. Sexual identity signaling shaped by narcissistic insecurity also interacts with comparison and competition dynamics. Because self-worth is externally referenced, the individual may constantly measure themselves against others, seeking to maintain superiority or uniqueness. Attention becomes a limited resource rather than a shared experience. Desire becomes a scoreboard rather than a connection. This can fuel jealousy, triangulation, rivalry, or subtle undermining behaviors, even in otherwise functional environments. Another consequence is emotional dependency on stimulation. When identity signaling becomes a primary regulation tool, periods of low attention or reduced validation can trigger dysregulation, irritability, emptiness, or desperation. The nervous system interprets reduced mirroring as threat rather than neutrality. This can drive impulsive behavior, overexposure, exaggerated signaling, or sudden relational shifts aimed at restoring stimulation. Importantly, this dynamic does not imply that sexual expression itself is unhealthy or deceptive. Authentic sexual identity is a natural part of human selfhood and connection. The dysfunction arises when identity expression becomes primarily a regulatory mechanism rather than a reflection of integrated self-awareness. When signaling replaces self-knowing, external response replaces internal grounding, and performance replaces presence, the system becomes unstable and dependent. For those who have been impacted by narcissistic dynamics, recognizing this mechanism provides clarity and emotional protection. It helps distinguish between genuine confidence and compensatory signaling, between embodied self-worth and image-driven validation seeking. It reduces personalization and self-blame when relational dynamics feel confusing or inconsistent. It supports healthier boundary setting and partner selection based on emotional stability rather than intensity or charm. At a deeper psychological level, narcissistic insecurity shaping sexual identity signaling reflects a universal human vulnerability. When identity is not safely anchored internally, the nervous system will seek mirrors externally. When self-worth is fragile, expression becomes performance. When vulnerability feels unsafe, image becomes armor. Narcissistic systems simply represent an extreme version of this adaptive strategy. True sexual confidence emerges not from signaling, but from integration. It arises when desire, boundaries, self-respect, emotional safety, and authenticity coexist harmoniously. It does not need to announce itself loudly or strategically because it is internally stable. It does not require constant feedback to remain intact. It does not fluctuate dramatically with attention or rejection. It remains grounded regardless of external response. When identity becomes internally coherent, signaling naturally softens. Expression becomes organic rather than strategic. Attraction becomes mutual rather than transactional. Connection becomes reciprocal rather than regulatory. In that environment, narcissistic insecurity loses its grip because the nervous system no longer depends on external mirrors to exist. How narcissistic insecurity shapes sexual identity. Signaling ultimately reveals that what appears as bold expression is often quiet compensation, and what appears as confidence is sometimes fragile scaffolding. Understanding this distinction restores discernment. protects emotional well-being, and invites deeper alignment with authentic selfhood rather than performative identity.